Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to Parenting in the 21st Century. I'm Zina Shevchik. Today we're going to have a discussion about suicide and its prevention. We have two guests today, both from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Mary Jean Coleman, who's the Regional Director, and Amy Molloy, who's the Area Director. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
It's a very important and serious topic. And would you tell us first a little bit about the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention?
Okay. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Zina, a lot of people don't know about. It is the leading national not-for-profit in our country, the leading funder of research in surrounding suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. And everything the foundation does is grounded in that science. The programs then that the foundation produces are the result of the research and the knowledge base that's gained from that research.
And what kind of programs are you talking about?
We educate professionals, we educate communities, community public awareness about suicide and its prevention. We have many survivor programs. A survivor being, when we talk about suicide survivors, we talk about someone who's lost a loved one to suicide. I myself lost my brother to suicide in 1979, so just over 30 years ago.
So you are basically an outreach, you do outreach for education about suicide and its prevention.
Yes.
To not just professionals, but you go out into the community.
That's right. That's right.
So you would be a resource. I'm just suggesting, since you're a regional director, do you want to tell me what that encompasses versus area director?
Lots of fancy titles, and the bottom line is it isn't the fancy titles, it's the work that's being done in suicide prevention in our state, in our communities, and in our nation. My job with the foundation is as regional director of the upstate New York chapter, so I oversee 4 of the chapters in New York State. And I also am the National Director of Field Programs, so I help communities bring suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention work to communities.
So an area director, Amy, is a chapter, a local chapter, and does that encompass more than the capital region as we usually think about it?
Yes.
Or?
Yeah. Actually, it's a very large chapter. The capital region chapter covers 14 counties, from Columbia Green, just south of Albany, and all the way north. So we have an area director, myself, and we also have a board of directors and a number of very dedicated volunteers who work to deliver the programs that Mary Jean talked about.
Okay, now let's start talking about the topic.
Okay.
Tell us about how many people are affected by suicide.
Well, we know it's reported that there are 32,000 suicides in our country annually. We know that in New York State, anywhere between 12 to 1,300 suicides are reported every year. We know that it's the 3rd leading cause of death for our teens, 2nd for our college students. And we know that for every 1 suicide, it's reported that there are 6 to 8 people who are profoundly affected. When I say reported, I can assure you, we were from a very large Roman Catholic family. When my brother died by suicide, far more than 6 to 8 people were profoundly affected by his death. So we can say 32,000 in our country, 12 to 1,300 in our state that are reported, but we really don't know. Many suicides are not reported as a death by suicide. So for example, when I said teens, it was the 3rd leading cause of death for our teens. Accidents are actually 2nd for our teenagers as a cause of death. And we question how many single car accidents may have in fact been a suicide but are reported as a death, by an accident. Also, I give the example that my brother was born and raised in the state of New York, but he took his own life in the state of Georgia. And so his suicide was reported there in the state of Georgia. So at best, we know that our statistics are kind of swayed and underestimated.
Okay, so that's the point, is that it's certainly underestimated.
That's right.
What are some risk factors that increase a person's chance of, and you use the word completing suicide. I don't know if the risk factors might be for people trying to complete suicide.
You asked, I should have a pencil and a paper so I can write these down. You actually, so let's come back to I use the words completed, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Good.
But, because terminology is really, really important here. So let's hold off on that piece because I do want to talk about stigma and shame and how terminology plays into that. But in terms of, we used to use, actually this is good in terms of terminology, because we used to talk about, we always heard warning signs of suicide. And now what we're working to do is a bit more community-minded, and we talk about invitations that we see, that someone may have thoughts of suicide. So what are some of those invitations that someone might offer to us that they're thinking about suicide? And those are the things, when we talk about educating and community awareness, so what are some of those things that we see, hear, sense, or learn about someone? So we might see that someone is perhaps giving things away. We hear about that. We might see that someone is getting their things in order or writing out a will. Right? We might hear someone, one of the biggest invitations is what we hear. So we might hear someone say, I'm thinking about taking my own life. This world would be better off without me. Verbal, what we might hear. Things that we sense. So we might sense that somebody is kind of pulling back or withdrawing, or that sense of isolation. Things that we might learn about. We might learn that someone has had a past history with suicide, whether it was that they had themselves attempted or that they had lost a loved one to suicide, and both increase that risk.
I would imagine if it's part of your experience, in the sense that you know of suicide in someone who you know, whether it be a family member or a teacher or a coach, or just know of someone who was touched by suicide. Just the idea, I would assume.
Well, there's a familiarity with, and we could talk about this for hours in terms of the research that surrounds that. But what we know, the best information that we have, is that suicide is an act. Suicide itself is not hereditary. We do see multiple suicides sometimes in the same family, because we know that 90% of all suicides are related to a psychiatric illness. Okay. Most often that psychiatric illness is depression, and we do know that psychiatric illnesses can run in families. Okay. Now the good news is that most often it's depression, and depression is one of the most treatable mental or psychiatric illnesses.
90%, you're saying?
Yes.
Of reported suicides?
Yep.
Or
90% of those who take their own lives, who actually die by suicide, and that have a mental illness, psychiatric illness of some sort. Now the key is whether or not that illness, and when I'm talking about psychiatric illness, it's diagnosed, undiagnosed, treated, untreated, undertreated, so we know that 90% fall within that.
Okay, so from what I hear is that you're saying that suicide is not hereditary, but mental illness may be, but that mental illness is treatable,
yes.
Fixable.
Yep.
So in other words, you're saying that suicide is preventable.
Yes.
If
Yes.
the causes can be addressed, and if people are aware.
Yes.
And if people are comfortable talking about it, and Mary Jean, when you asked her in the question about warning signs, she talked about having that kind of sensing that something is wrong. And so a lot of what we do in our community education programs is make people comfortable with asking, because chances are if you're thinking that they might be thinking it, they may have thought it as well. And so we want people to be comfortable asking, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of our community education programs, but one of them is called Safe Talk, and that stands for Suicide Alertness for Everyone. Tell, ask, listen, keep safe. And so it's that tell, ask, listen, keep safe that we want people to be comfortable with. To recognize when somebody is telling you something verbally or non-verbally, to feel comfortable asking them. And sometimes it's difficult, especially, this is parenting in the 21st century, so we want to talk about parents. For parents, it's difficult to say, gosh, I'm really concerned you're acting differently, or your grades have dropped, or whatever it is. I'm really concerned, are you thinking about suicide?
What's tough, as the mother of two girls who just finished their teenage years, it's really tough sometimes to get them to talk to you and to understand what is a normal kind of rite of passage of a teenager and what can be pathological. Is that the right word? So I think that's tough for whether it's a parent or a teacher or clergy, whoever's around a person. And I think maybe teenagers are a little bit harder to determine. My experience would be that it would be a little harder because teenage years are all about change, and they change from day to day sometimes, and what the peaks and valleys are in their lives. I'm just offering that as it might be harder to interpret a teenager's behavior than it might be with other young children or adults, older adults. Am I on the right track here, or am I way off base?
No, you're on base. The key really, Zina, is the alertness, and as Amy said, not being afraid to ask. So if you see some of those invitations that there's a change, so ask about those changes, and it is being able to ask openly and directly about suicide.
To actually say, are you thinking about hurting yourself?
Well, we can say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? So I could pull my hair, or I could, take that pen and that would hurt, but it wouldn't mean that I'm thinking about suicide.
So you're saying you actually use the word suicide.
Yeah, we believe that that's the biggest prevention piece that we can have, is to ask, to talk about it openly and directly.
Say it out loud.
Yep.
And recognize that you're right. It may be more difficult for a teenager to talk to one person versus another person, but that's why we look to educate the entire community. Because the person that somebody who's in trouble might go to may not be the parent, may not be the coach. It might be the neighbor, or it might be a pastor. It could be anybody. And so we really work to educate the whole community, knowing that anybody at any time could be in a position to be able to offer that support. And so again, the last two pieces of that were listen to what is being said and keep safe. Find the resources in the community. Find people who can then continue to help that person.
Yeah, I just, again, from my own experience, it's so easy to withdraw from a teenager's life as a parent or just adult, because it seems so often that that's what they want you to do. They want you to leave them alone to cope with whatever changes are happening or new experiences are they want to do it apart from the adults sometimes. I mean, that's the impression you get. So I think a lot of parents are very hesitant to do that, to actually address directly what's going on in a teenager's life. And it's good to hear that the new research, and that's what I understand from your saying about talking about the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, is that you are operating from the most current research there is, and that you're always changing your as research changes, you incorporate that into your message about how to prevent suicide. And so you're talking about addressing directly suicide with your with anyone around you, and that's been proven from what you know.
And certainly, maybe you're going. Certainly, one of the biggest myths that's out there is that if you talk about suicide with someone, you'll put the idea in their head. You'll plant the idea where it wouldn't have been. And I'll go back to what Amy said a couple moments ago. Chances are that if the thought of suicide has crossed your mind, chances are it's already crossed that person's mind. So this person has been giving you invitations that make you think, is he or she thinking about taking his or her own life? And chances are, you're not chances are, but research does tell us that you won't put the idea in someone's head. In fact, research does tell us that if we ask openly and directly, we may be that first linkage for the person to seek out those resources that Amy spoke about, or for us to help that person get to those resources. So asking about suicide openly and directly can actually be that first door into services for help.
That's great. So.
And I think it's important too not to wait until that moment to talk about it. You know, we don't, as parents, we don't wait until we find a pack of cigarettes in, our child's room to talk about not smoking. So there's a lot that we do as a chapter and other chapters across the country do just to raise awareness in general in the community. We have community walks. They're called Out of the Darkness community walks. They happen in the fall. We have campus walks that happen in the spring. In our chapter, we have a hike up Prospect Mountain that's coming up on May 23rd. So these are opportunities to get young people, students, even student groups from schools, involved in raising funds, having fun, but learning about mental illness and learning about suicide and learning. And a lot of times students will come kind of to us, as a group because maybe they've lost somebody and this is their opportunity to kind of give back and they don't want to see it happen again.
The one other event that's huge that we do, and I haven't talked about it even so far, is advocacy. And so it's giving, my voice alone isn't as strong as Amy's or yours combined with that voice. And so one of the biggest events that we do in the Capital Region is called, actually it's statewide, but we meet, this year it's March 10th, right? On the steps of the New York State Capitol, and our youth do attend. They are our future voters and our future voices. But the event is called Mental Health Matters, and it's an opportunity for people across our state to meet with their legislators and let our legislators know that mental health matters and that funding should not be cut for mental health research or suicide prevention efforts within our state.
And this is budget time in New York State. We're taping on February 2nd and 2010, and certainly New York State is having its share of budget problems as they deliberate right now for next year's budget. I was thinking about the other people in other than parents, is that teachers, clergy, are they under any restraint to talk about to talk about suicide with people they see? I mean, is it particularly with young people? I mean, is it something that like in a school, a teacher would be reluctant to bring it up to a child for fear that their parents or somebody else might be not want that kind of thing excuse me, to be talked about with their child? Is that anything that I'm just curious, if I was a teacher in a school, what would the normal process be? Would they go to a guidance counselor or a psychologist in a school and say, I'm worried about this child? Is that usually what
would a student go, you mean? Or
no, would a teacher, like if a teacher or I don't know, a coach in a school situation, are they like social workers? Aren't certain people bound to to report child abuse? And is there any kind of limits or legal restraints or requirements?
That's going to vary. My answer to that would be it's going to vary from school to place of employment to a place of employment. A lot of questions are rolled up in your question. So mandated reporters certainly are there are people that are mandated to report harm to self or harm to others.
Okay, that's what I wasn't sure of.
Yeah, so certainly social workers and counselors and teachers, I believe all teachers are mandated reporters. So if there was harm to self or harm to others, they would need to report it, whatever that reporting mechanism is within that school or within that place of employment.
What's going through my head is that if you were around a person who seemed at risk, and you think, well, that's a parent's job to take care of that. I think that's what goes through people's minds.
And that's why we work so hard to educate that it's okay to ask. And we just, I just keep going back to, we know that most suicides are related to that mental illness and that many are treatable. And new treatments based on the research come out all the time, good treatment. So we can't be afraid to ask, any one of us, and that's why we work so hard. Capital Region Chapter especially does a tremendous amount of work with those trainings that Amy spoke of. Safe Talk, which is suicide alertness for everyone, tell, ask, listen, keep safe.
So you're training volunteers.
We're training anyone in a community. Safe Talk's for anyone in a community.
Good. What if you were asked someone if they were thinking about suicide and they were hemming and hawing, if they didn't say yes, if they were hemming and hawing, what's the next step for someone who suspects there might be thoughts of suicide in a friend
and
or
someone
coworker?
Says no, so you ask and they say no? Well, we always say, so I'll go back to those invitations again. So there were invitations that person gave to you that made you ask in the first place, right?
Right.
So there was something that had changed that made you ask. And so you ask, they tell you no, we say go back to those invitations again. So I might say to you, Zina, sometimes when people are missing work or worrying about things or pulling away from family and friends, they're thinking about suicide. And are you thinking about suicide? So you go back to those very invitations that brought you to ask in the first place. And then if you still get that no, and your gut is saying, I just don't believe it, Amy spoke about that keep safe piece. So we just moved to the keep safe then.
Are there are phone numbers that can be used for people who are worried about not just themselves but somebody else in their environment, in their world?
Does it show it here? We have it's 1-800-273-TALK.
Okay.
That is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. And there's a misconception sometimes that you have to feel suicidal yourself to call the hotline. But that's not true. So you could call if you're worried about a loved one, a teen. There's also a hotline within the Capital Region called the Samaritans. I'm not sure that they're 24/7, but they are another available resource within the Capital Region.
Okay, we'll get that at the end of the program. We'll make sure that that's up on the website too. Talk about what the reaction is when there is a completed suicide, and what the repercussions are, the consequences, and what it does to family and coworkers and fellow students. Or this is, as I said, it's February 2010, and there was an unexpected, or that's how it was reported in the media, suicide in the area, and it's been in the media a lot. And talk about what schools do and what parents should do if a suicide occurs. It could be these days it doesn't have to be someone close. It's in the media, right? I mean, so you feel like it might be close to you.
Well, it might be close because your family has experienced it. You may have someone in your family who's attempted. So when we see it in the media, it can feel very close.
Right, that's what I'm saying, and there's always questions why, and what's the usual, like in a school situation? What do they just social workers just make themselves available? Is that what happens to talk? Is that what they try to do? They try to make it a public discussion if need be, so that it's not hidden. That's I guess the goal. Am I right? That people, so that teenagers or adults other teenagers, survivors in effect, don't pull away as well, don't pull back and try to address it, as you have indicated, head on. That's the best way. That's what they're attempting to do.
One of our programs is called the Survivor Outreach Program, actually. So, and I think that's kind of where you're going at. But one of the, well, first of all, you use the word why. So that is definitely one factor that connects all survivors, I think, who've lost somebody to suicide, is that huge question of why. I say that when my brother died by suicide, it was as if a 5,000-piece puzzle, maybe even 50,000-piece puzzle, got thrown up in the air, and we're still looking for those pieces some 30 years later to link them together. So why unites us? But one of the other big pieces that unites someone who's lost a loved one to suicide is that sense of feeling alone, as though no one else has been here, done that, talked about it. So our Survivor Outreach Program actually is an outreach immediately after a suicide, to be able to talk about it and then to be able to link the newly bereaved with the resources that are out in a community. And that's by invitation. So someone would call our office, either Amy or I, and we would work to set up an outreach. Whether that's in a school after a suicide happens, whether it's in a place of business, in the community, in a person's home. So it's that linking, again, a person with those resources and not having to feel so alone, and to talk about it.
Yeah, I would think that there would be a tremendous, for a lot of survivors, there would be a tremendous amount of guilt that they didn't pick up about or sense what was happening, or they didn't ask that question, which is, what goes on in my mind. Is it better that there's actually a completed suicide, or is it better that I potentially offend somebody by actually asking that question? So I would imagine there would be a tremendous amount of guilt for survivors.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I hindsight's 2020. I've wished a million times over the course of the last 3 decades that I had asked my brother. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big proponent for asking.
Yeah,
I wish I had. I might still have him.
Right.
And certainly, times have changed in the last 3 decades too. We are talking about it.
Amy and I were, just before we went on air, were talking about how 30, 40 years ago, it was much easier to keep things quiet in a family. If a family wanted to keep an event like a mental illness or an attempted suicide or completed suicide quiet, it was. These days, it's almost impossible with texting and Twitter and the web and the media picking up on it. It's almost impossible. So maybe that's the good part of the media.
And so if a suicide happens in a school, then, we know it's already. Right. So let's be honest about the facts. Let's talk about it. It's an opportunity for other students to kind of look out for each other, for school communities to look out not only for other students, but for teachers and counselors and principals. We are all affected. Our Mental Health Matters Day talks about 1 in 5. So 1 in 5 individuals will know someone who dies by suicide within their lifetime. 1 in 5 Americans lives with a mental illness. So, it's an opportunity for all of us to talk about it.
And these are tough times, economic times, and in the country. And so I think that people are more worried and more stressed than they might have been at another time. So this is a time, in my opinion, to be even more open to discussions about the effect of stress and the potential for this kind of suicide attempts. It's just more important for this stuff to be out in the open these days. I just want to ask you to discuss briefly, because we don't have much time, is to talk a little bit about the elderly and depression and suicide in the elderly, because it's a little bit different than what happens with teenagers and young adults and adults. So would you talk about that a little bit?
We know that, is it over 54 is one of the fastest growing.
Age 54 and up.
Yeah.
55 and up is the
Right.
fastest growing population in terms of
an increase. And I think you're looking at a lot of different things. You're looking at, of course, mental illness that is across the lifespan. But you're also looking at just the aging process and how that is for people. But also when you look at that age group too, you also need to look at people who are caring for them as well. So we kind of talked about parents caring for younger people. We talked about parents caring now for their parents, their aging parents as well. And then there's other, things related to age that could have an impact.
We talk and hear a lot about suicide among our teenagers. And many people don't know that the highest rates of suicide actually are among our elderly. And loss is the biggest. If we can talk about what is an invitation, what are some of those things we see, hear, sense, or learn about. Loss is huge within that population, within that age group.
Meaning it could be loss of a partner, loss of sight, loss
absolutely.
of ability to live independently. So there's a lot
Loss
of grieving.
of employment too. And we talk about
Retirement,
stressors.
yeah.
I was going to say before, so loss of employment for one person, stressors are different for every person. So loss of employment for one person, being retirement, might be the greatest thing that's going to happen. But for someone else, it may be a huge loss, negatively. So stressors are certainly, and when we talk about our teens, stressors are very different from teen to teen, and what we might worry about as parents are very different from what they worry about as teenagers.
Yeah. So it's important to look at any life change.
As the mom of 3 little ones.
Yes. It's important, I think, to look at any life change, like you said, retirement or a move or graduation. There's lots of things that, there are just so many stressors. There's so many factors that play into this. It's why we can't answer that question, why, because it is so complicated. There are so many different things that play into somebody's thoughts of suicide.
Before we end, I would like to give you the opportunity to bring up anything we weren't able to talk about that you think should be brought up or emphasized, and talk a little bit about your programs.
The biggest thing I think we can do is offer our website, because all of this information is on the website. There's a ton of information there.
Would you just say the website?
Sure. It's www.A as in American, F as in Foundation, S as in Suicide, P as in Prevention, AFSP.org.
Okay. And they'll find all sorts of access to pamphlets, to DVDs, to local chapters, phone numbers, and there's a lot of information. I mean, you can just read on that site. I found it an excellent website. The information that's available, everything we've talked about here is available on that website.
Yep.
So it's a terrific foundation, and I thank you, Mary Jean Coleman, Amy Molloy from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, for coming to educate our audience today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for being with us on Parenting in the 21st Century.